Welcome to another video tutorial. In this video, we're going to cover something that is quite commonly asked on the Discord, which is how do you reference enemies in a tactical turn-based battle map? This might be, for example, you want to attach something to an enemy, or you might want to equip something on an enemy, or assign a property to an enemy, or reference one of its stats. So the reason why this is a problem is that for most cases, when you, for example, place an entity on a map in the map editor, you can go into its properties and you can assign it what's called an entity ID. So for example, I could call this Goblin 1. That allows me in my scripts to be able to reference this goblin whenever I want by referencing Goblin 1. Okay? So you need to give your entities IDs in order to be able to reference them in scripts. So if you want to give this goblin a property, or attach a model to it, or give it a stat, or whatever, you're going to need to give it an ID. Okay. Now, another way that you can do this, if the entity doesn't already exist on the map, let's say you spawn it in at a later date, then in your script, in your script editor, you can make a script. Let's call this goblin spawn. And in your script, you can use an add character function where we can say add a goblin at, let's say, let's do this via the text, at coordinate 1, 0, 0. And then we can give it an ID. So here we could put in, for example, Goblin 1. So now we can reference, even though it didn't exist before, we can now reference the goblin that's been spawned in at any point we want by referring to Goblin 1, because Goblin 1 will be the one we've just spawned. Okay? The problem, however, comes when you want to reference enemies that have been spawned via the turn-based battle system, because neither of these things applies. First of all, we didn't add the goblin in ourselves via a script because they were added in by the battle system mechanics. But also, if we take a look at a battle map, for example, let's load my battle map up. It doesn't have any entities on it because they're supposed to be spawned in when we load this map to have a battle. So this map will be populated by, for example, goblins, if they're the enemy type, in our combat settings, which we'll get to in a moment. So the problem is we've got no way of assigning an ID to those enemies because we didn't spawn them in via a script and they didn't exist in the map editor to be able to give them an ID. So they're going to be spawned in by the battle system mechanics, but without an ID. So if we want to do anything to those entities, it gets very tricky because the whole point of IDs is that's how you reference things in script. But if they don't have an ID, how can you reference something? So it does become this very tricky thing to achieve. So I want to show you in this video a way to be able to achieve that and how you can actually reference all or some or a specific one of enemies that are in a battle map. So the first thing you want to do is in your battle map, you want to select any area where enemies are going to spawn. So if you've set up for example, these red tiles here, I could set these up as let me just select box mode for a second. I could select these 9 tiles up as a spawn group. So I could add these to a group called Goblin Zone. Okay. And then when I go to a battle setup, so let's quickly go through this. So I want to add an enemy, Goblin. And the model is going to be Goblin Sword. And let's say you get 5 experience per goblin. And then we create a battle called Battle 1. and it's going to be a tactical turn-based battle. The battle map is going to be the battle map that gets loaded, and the player can spawn on a random tile. We're going to drag in Goblin, and we're going to say, let's have 2 of them, but we can restrict them to a random tile within a certain group. So we could say Goblin Zone. So now what we're basically saying, let's save this, is when we play this battle, only on these red tiles are 2 goblins going to spawn. They're not going to spawn anywhere on these grey tiles. Now they can move out of the red tiles over the course of the battle onto the grey tiles, but they're not going to start on the grey tiles. So first of all, understanding that, if you need to understand first of all where are your enemies going to be situated at the start of the battle map. Is there a specific area where you're going to be restricting them to, or can they spawn anywhere on the entire map? So for example, if I was to set this back to just random tile, then that's a random tile anywhere on this map. Okay, so if that's how you've set it up so that the enemies can spawn anywhere on the entire map, then you want to select the entire floor of your map. So every possible tile where a goblin, in this case, could spawn needs to be selected. Okay, if it's just a small group like this one, then you're going to use that group. Okay, I'm going to undo the group. So let's delete Goblin Zone because it's a very small example zone and I'm not going to use it for the actual tutorial. So I'm going to set these goblins to spawn anywhere, random tile, across the entire of this map. So what we want to do is we want to select every possible tile that a goblin might spawn on, and we're going to add that to a group, and we'll just call this Arena, seeing as it's a good name for the entire battle map. So you want to give your entire floor plan, put it into a group and call it something. Okay, that's step 1, and then save your map. Step 2 is now to go to your script, and we're going to change this goblin spawn script. And I'm going to do this via the text just because it's a lot quicker and easier for me to do. But what we're going to do is we're going to type for. We're going to create what's essentially called a for loop. We're going to say for $tile reference in group arena do, and then we'll just close it off. So what we're basically saying is loop through everything that's in group arena. Well, in this case, that's all of the floor tiles. So we're saying for every floor tile in the entirety of this map, do the following. So what we want to do is we want to check the current floor tile that it's now currently on as it loops through. So it's going to check each floor tile and check dot characters. What this will do is this is going to check, is there a character on that tile? So not equal to null. So if it's not null, then it means there was a character found on this specific tile. The next thing we need to check is if tileref.characters 0, that just means it's a reference to the actual specific character that's on that tile. We want to make sure it's not the player, because the player will be included in that, because the player is a character as well. So we need to make sure we're filtering out the player, that we only get the enemies. So we're basically looping through all of the tiles in the map, and if there's a character on that tile, and if that character is not the player, then as long as it's not a party member, in my case I don't have a party, but if you did have a party, then you would also check that, for example, you could give your party members tags. We'll get to tags in a minute. I'll give you a practical example of those. But you might, for example, use tags to check the character's tag to make sure it's not a party member, for example. So in this case, though, we can rule out party members because I don't have any. So the only other type of entity left is therefore an enemy. So we can now assume that if it's found a character and that character isn't player, then it must be a goblin. So now we can do something with that specific goblin. for example, we can say $enemy equals $tile ref dot characters 0. So if it's not the player, then store what it is inside $enemy. So now $enemy can be used to change that goblin. So for example, what we could do is we could say $enemy dot scale equals, and scale is an array because you've got your X, Y, Z. So 2, 2, 2. Let's make it double the size in all directions. Okay, and let's apply and save. So what this script is essentially doing is it's going to loop through the entirety of the battle map, and it's going to find all the characters, and as long as the character isn't a player, then it's going to store the current enemy in an enemy variable, and then it's going to set the scale of that enemy to double its size, and it's going to do that for every enemy it finds throughout the battle map. So what this script is going to essentially do is when we start the battle, all the goblins are going to be double the size. Okay. Now, the only other thing we need to do next, once we've saved our script, is it needs to go into the post load script setting for your battle map. So the map that gets loaded when you have a battle, put your starting script, in this case goblin spawn, as the post load script. So this script will automatically happen once this map has loaded, i.e. the battle has started. So if we save the game, let's go to our starting map, because we need a way, that's not the starting map, we need a way to be able to trigger the battle. So let's put a goblin in, and we'll say when we interact, start battle, battle 1. And let's test. So let's interact with the goblin. And now we get 2 scaled up goblins, because it basically ignored the player, because when it found the characters, it ignored the player one and then scaled up the remaining ones. So in this case, it scaled up the 2 goblins. Okay. We could also give IDs to goblins. So for example, we could say $incrementer equals 0. So this is something that's going to increment. And then if it is not a player, then we can increment the counter by 1. So the first enemy will be 1. And then once we've stored characters, we can say $enemy.id equals enemy or goblin underscore $ open and close squiggly brackets, and then inside $incrementer. So each goblin, as you loop through, is going to be given a unique auto-generated ID. So the first one will be goblin underscore 1, the second one will be goblin underscore 2, and then that way you can actually refer to entity goblin underscore, in this case we want to do all of them, so we'll just do goblin $inc, and that will do it. It's essentially going to be no different, except if we now test it. Oh yeah, Rublin, that's not going to work. So here we go, we've got 2 giant-sized goblins, but we also have the benefit now of knowing their IDs. Goblin underscore 1 actually comes back as a goblin. It actually comes back as something, and likewise goblin 2. So for example, if you wanted to only scale the second goblin, then instead of or just scaling the first one, you could just do that, right? So you might want to check, first of all, just to be on the safe side, if entity goblin underscore 1 is not null. So that way it won't error if it doesn't exist. It will only do it if it does exist. Yeah, it will only do if it does exist, right? So it's just ensuring that when we assign the ID, that it won't scale it if it doesn't, unless there is something already with that ID, okay? But this should now only scale the first goblin because it's going to be specifically goblin 1 that we're referencing. And there we go. So this must therefore be goblin 1. So let's check that. We can print self.id, and that's goblin 1. If we hover over this one and repeat that, that's goblin 2, right? So let's quickly quit. So you can do all sorts of this position. Once you've been able to give these things IDs, you can do anything you want. So for example, we could, instead of scaling, well, let's do two things. Let's scale goblin 1, but we can also attach, let's have a bit of fun. We can attach object, traffic cone, entity, goblin 1. Each traffic cone has a cone base attach point, and each goblin has a head attach point. So now we should have a rather big goblin with a traffic cone attached at the start of the battle. Come here. And there we go. So you can start to see how you can start to mess around with things a bit more in battle maps. Whereas before we couldn't access anything in terms of the enemies, now we can actually start referencing them, because what we're essentially doing is we're looping through, by looping through the map and grabbing all the characters in the map, we can then mess around with those entities, and we can give them IDs. We can then use those IDs if we want to, or we can just reference them as we loop through. As I say, you can give things tags. So let's say, for example, we duplicate this goblin and we call it goblin red. Let's edit the goblin, and we'll go to replace color with red, and that should be all frames with red. So let's save that. And then what we can do is we can go into its tags, and we can give it a tag. Let's say red. Wait, let's just give it the tag red, right? So this might be, for example, how you filter out party members. So what we can do is we can go back to us. Well, let's first of all include it in the battle. So let's set up a red goblin. This needs to be goblin red. Let's say it gives you 7 experience points. Let's put one of those in the map. Doesn't matter where. And then we'll go back to our script and we'll say, instead of doing every enemy, we can say if $enemy dot tags contains red, then $enemy scale double, and attach object to $enemy. So instead of referencing it specifically by its ID, we're now doing it via tags. So as I say, you could use this for either filtering to a particular type of enemy, or you could filter out a particular type of enemy. So you could say if enemy tags does not contain something, then do all of this. So if enemy tags contains enemy, then you know it's an enemy. So you could give all your enemies a tag enemy, and therefore that would filter out your party members because they wouldn't have the tag enemy, for example. So, but in this case, we're going to use it just to focus in on the one type of enemy we've got in our map, which is the goblin red. So if it contains that tag, then we want to scale that particular reference and put a traffic cone on its head. So what should happen now is only the red goblin will be double the size and have a traffic cone on its head. Yeah? So hopefully this is making sense. And then, you can do all sorts of things. For example, we could then give it a property. So, for example, starts out true. So now, if we quick play, and we hover over the red goblin and we print self.property is alive, it's true. But if I hover over this one and I repeat that, it's null because none of the green goblins have that property because we only put it on the red goblin in our script. So, other things obviously you could do, you could change the model. So let's not have it attach a traffic cone. We could say set entity model red slime. I think it's the reference first, isn't it? So $enemy and then red slime. In fact, let's do this the other way around. We'll change the model and then we'll change the scale just in case it loses the scale by changing the model. And there we go. So all of a sudden, instead of a red goblin, it's now a red slime. So you can even change the model. I just want to check something. Print self.behavior. Yeah. So I noticed that turn-based battle enemies don't have behaviors assigned because obviously, it's a completely different system. They're moving based on turns and they're moving based on, how many grid spaces they can move. They're not moving based on a real-time map system like they are on a normal map. So it makes sense why they don't use behaviors. So the reason I bring that up is because if you go to the documentation and look up behaviors, we have these scripting things. For example, we could put a on-def script. But the problem is, even if we were to assign it, so if we were to say, we could try it, I suppose. Basically, what I was thinking is that you could say $enemy.behavior on def script equals, and then if you had a script, let's say called victory, then that would basically be the equivalent of in the real map, putting a script on def run script. But we're basically doing that here. We're saying on def script, set it to whatever script you want. Let's test that quickly because I'm curious to see if it will work, because I don't know if it will. So let's test it here and now, and we'll make this the last thing we do. So to close out, let me just quickly create a victory script. resource already exists. Oh, do I already have one called victory? I do. So we can use that. What does it do? You won the battle. Let's change that to you killed the red boss. And we'll just see what happens. So, it's a quick play. I'm practically dead. Let me cheat. Dot stat HP equals 100. Okay. So let's see what happens when we kill no, it didn't attack. It didn't trigger the script. So, some things might not work. There are limitations to the battle system at the moment. It's still being worked on and things. So, there might be, even though you can reference the enemies, there might be limits to what you can do with them. But this is just to show you how you can reference them and see what you can do with it. So with that said, that will wrap up this video. Stay tuned for the next one. Thanks for watching.